Welcome to All the F Words,
a podcast where two writer friends, nearly 30 years apart, explore everything we give an F about. I'm Gabby Moskowitz.
And I'm Joanne Green. On each episode of All the F Words, we'll focus on a theme starting with the letter F. Things like flesh, fortune, and fumbling.
We'll share stories from our lives and our distinct generational perspectives, and we'll look to the experts for insights and ideas.
Today we're going to talk about fundamentalism, as in religious fundamentalism.
That is, those who take everything in the foundational text for their religion, specifically in this episode, we're talking about the Bible, as the literal truth.
Not exactly my particular brand of faith, to use another F word.
Nor mine, but today we're going to talk about why fundamentalism is on the rise and what that means for the world.
Oh, sounds like a nice, light topic.
When we were first brainstorming F words and naming things, fundamentalism is something that I feel like I keep confronting over and over again because it is very much on the rise. Truthfully, I didn't know that much about it other than that in general, I don't really subscribe to it. I think for some people, kind of some misconceptions about where it comes from. The way it's used now, fundamentalism and is a noun, and it's a form of a religion, specifically Protestant Christianity is generally what fundamentalism refers to in the United States. There are many kinds of fundamentalist religions that we'll talk about, but we're mostly going to be talking about fundamentalist Christianity today. And it upholds a belief that you should have a strict and literal interpretation of Scripture. And it comes from fundamentalism, which was a sect of Protestant Christianity that came about in the late 19th, early 20th century to defend the fundamentals of belief against what was perceived as a corrosive effect of liberalism, which, we know what liberalism is, but in religion, liberalism in the Protestant community, liberalism started to sort of come as was becoming a trend, and fundamentalism was the sort of response to that by some members of the Protestant church. Do you know about this whole thing? Do you know much about?
Yes and no is the answer. So I'm no religious scholar, but I do know that there have always been pendulums in really every religion where there's a move toward reform in one way or another, and then a fear that the basics and the authentic religion is being watered down, bastardized, whatever. So then there is a pendulum swing or some subset of adherents to that religion then grab onto the law. This certainly is true in Judaism. There is something called the law, halakha, and Reform Judaism has gotten pretty far afield from that, and that is to some observant Jews offensive and not even Jewish, right? So you have this in all different religions. You certainly have it in Islam. There are people who are absolutely intolerant of women who choose not to wear a hijab and claim that they are not really true Muslims if they're not, for instance, praying 5 times a day or, eating only halal meats. I mean, all of this kind of thing. But no doubt, when we talk about fundamentalism and when we talk about it in this country, in the United States, impacting, for instance, our laws and our courts, what we're talking about is Christian fundamentalism.
Yeah. And we're going to get a little bit into the political connections with fundamentalism, but I really like what you said about the pendulum, because that, I've always thought culturally that there's really a pendulum. And if you look at the way elections tend to go, obviously religion plays a part for many people, but we tend to swing back and forth from more conservative. I mean, if you look at like the way that the sock hop era of the 50s was a response to kind of like post-Victorian times, but then it still was very buttoned up. And then the 60s and 70s were a response to, and as we talked about in our free love and freaks episodes, that was a response to those more buttoned up times. And then the 80s had its own version of that. And if you look at the way elections happen, we do tend to, as a country, liberal, to go from liberal to conservative and back and forth, even though the majority of people are not necessarily changing their minds. It's just that the polar ends of the spectrum are getting stronger and more intense as we go through time. And it's been interesting for me to watch the rise, especially of Christian fundamentalism, and the way that it has impacted our culture so much as we become, in many ways, if TV is to be believed, a much more open and welcoming culture where it's on trend. I feel silly putting it that way, but as it becomes more and more common to see different kinds of people with different kinds of lifestyles being uplifted in the public eye, the Christian fundamentalists' voices become louder and stronger and more aggressive. So
I would say, Gabby, that fear plays an enormous role in the rise of fundamentalism and this pendulum swinging effect. And as fundamentalism begins to rise or begins to infiltrate increasing aspects of our society and our culture, then you have a cry for more freedom. But I think what happens is people are frightened that if things become too loose, chaos will ensue. And so they grab onto a system that keeps things in check. So a set of laws, a set of beliefs, a set of strictures that will that will limit the risk or lower the risk of things becoming out of control, of the other taking over, right? So when you see like white supremacy gaining prominence, and certainly in the Trump era there, I said the T word, the notion...
Oh, we're going to say it a few more times.
Okay. But the notion that things that we, on the more liberal side of things, always thought of as extreme, absolutely extreme, somehow being legitimized. And what that, I think, appealed to and how Trump got elected in the first place was people's fear that this is no longer a white dominant culture. And if things continue in the direction that they are, we are going to be largely a culture that is filled by people of color, that, trans and gay and bisexual and all of these different manifestations of gender and sexuality are becoming mainstream. There is a certain fear that then motivates, I think, a swing to the right or a grasping at some religious notion of what is right and what is good.
Well, let me speak a little bit to where that fear, when you talk about fear, I read a really interesting article in Psychology Today that was kind of about the way that fundamentalism hijacks the brain. And it starts with this explanation that when humans first gained the cognitive capacity to reason and plan for the future, they immediately became aware of their own mortality. And it's sort of, really essential to the human experience and the human condition, right? Is knowing that this, no matter how well you take care of yourself and how lucky you are, this life will eventually end. And that realization that oneself and all one's loved ones will one day die is naturally terrifying. And this existential fear perfectly sets the stage for anything that someone perceives to be anxiety reducing. And so this is where, for some of us, we find spirituality, healthy spirituality, or we find exercise or whatever it is. And then some people find fundamentalist religion because fundamentalist religion offers simple answers. And they're, while I think you and I talk a lot on this episode about the fact that we don't know the answers, we don't have the answers, we're trying to find the answers. I remember even as a kid growing up, not really sure how I felt about God, but definitely identifying as a Jew and feeling a little bit jealous of my friends who were, I don't think necessarily fundamentalist, but who were religious Christians, because I remember thinking, it must feel so good to be so sure about something. And so fundamentalist religion says not only can you be sure about God, you can be sure that if you do all the things in this book, you're going to be okay, and everything's going to be okay, and the afterlife will be okay. And so all of the anxiety that let's be honest, we talk a lot about anxiety on this show. And the idea, it's very seductive, the idea that everything could be taken care of if you just follow this set of rules. And so that is where the T word, Donald Trump, really made a lot of progress in his campaign by offering a simple answer to a lot of people.
Well, and capitalizing on fear.
Yes, exactly. It's it's how cults work. And I'd like to come up with an F word for cults. I know maybe I should have done some cult research for this episode.
Fetishism. I don't know.
Right? Yeah. That could be good. Cults are sort of my we talked. In addition to feral children, cults are one of my pet internet wormhole interests, and I love a cult podcast or like a cult crime show. Very, very fond of those. But it's a very similar dynamic. Scared, vulnerable people, which is all of us, but there are some of us who are more scared and more vulnerable, very easily fall prey to this kind of thing. And where it becomes very dangerous is that part of agreeing to abide by all the rules of Scripture often means denying things that in modern life we understand to be true, like science. But if it doesn't,
or for instance, fact.
Well, yes, to bring in another important F word, fact. Yes. So that is where fundamentalism, there are many areas where fundamentalism is problematic, but one thing we are seeing over and over again in this political climate, and just literally the climate, is the way that that the more afraid, it's like this cycle where the more scared people are, the more they cling to fundamentalism, the more they deny what's going on around them. And I had so much anxiety last night when I was thinking about this episode, because I feel really strongly about being respectful of other people's beliefs, even if I don't agree with them, especially, religious beliefs, but this, we're in a really tricky era where I don't know.
Well, okay. So I will say a few things. One, where the line, the line between and the separation between church and state is becoming dangerously blurred. So that's A. B, I would say one of the big dangers of fundamentalism is that when you profess absolute adherence to a certain so-called truth, you will then seek evidence to prove that truth. And if something that you're seeing right there in black and white before you runs counter to that truth, you will simply deny it. Because if it doesn't support what you absolutely know and have a conviction about being true, then it can't be true. Therefore, boom, dismissed. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think there are different levels of this going on. So we have an inner core of people who truly are committed to a certain, however arbitrary you and I might view it, truth. But then you have the people who are committed to getting the support of those people and being a part of that larger group and feeling a part of a movement. In our last episode last week, we talked about how fanatics are often easily recruited among young men because they're seeking certain sorts of things. When we talk about cults and who is recruited to be in a cult, it is often young people who are at a point in their lives where perhaps they've finished college, but they don't know what's next, and they're seeking, and they're, maybe a little bit lost, totally ripe for being drawn into a religious cult or any sort of system that has strictures and detailed proscription for how to live one's life and what rules to follow.
I mean, who among us was not wishing for a handbook at some point in their lives, especially in your, early 20s, post college or post high school graduation or whatever it is, when you're finally, for the first time in your life, you don't have your parents telling you what to do anymore. It's like the desire to have especially if you run a little anxious and you have a desire to know for sure. And, I want to get into in a minute the way that fundamentalism spreads. But one, I do want to just bring up, and I think this can kind of be a through line for this episode if it rings true for you. I kept thinking while I was researching this episode, while I do not consider myself a fundamentalist about anything religious, I do tend to be a little bit obsessive compulsive about certain things. In fact, I had this experience last week where I was at a coffee shop working, and I had been eating a granola bar, and a little piece of the plastic from my granola bar flew away. It was kind of a breezy day, and it several feet away, not that far, but I don't like to litter, and I think anyone around me would have understood if I just let the garbage go. But I got up and it was kind of awkward and clunky. And I pushed, excused myself to move past some people to go fetch it. And this man said to me, he was sitting a few tables away. He said to me in a very kind voice, he said, is that compulsive behavior, or are you just worried about the garbage? And if he hadn't been so gentle, I would have been more annoyed at the weird invasive comment. But I said, yeah, no, maybe it's a little compulsive and also just climate responsibility. And then he smiled and we moved on. But I am like that. I ask my husband, my best friend, anyone I go on regular walks with, if I see a piece of garbage, I pick it up, even if it's gross, and put it in the garbage. And and then there are times when I see a piece of garbage and I have to manually override the desire to do that. But I'm always thinking about it. And I do think that we all have these, I think that there
rules. We all
ways.
have rules. This is one of your rules. And I think you're being a good citizen. And the fact that you're vigilant about it is definitely doing your part to maybe compensate for all the people who don't care at all and throw their wrappers right out the window. But before we leave this topic of obsessive compulsive, I think very specifically fundamentalist religion is super helpful for people who are OCD because it gives them an external system that has somebody's, i.e. God's, stamp of approval. So you don't have to invent it yourself. Time for us to take a quick break. We'll be back right after these messages.
Yeah, I think that that's true. I think that's absolutely true. It's sort of like, I remember thinking that a little bit about when COVID first became a thing that everyone was talking about. And there's this great show on Showtime called Work in Progress. Have you seen it?
No.
It's just a story about someone in Chicago, and it's really great. And she's dealing with a lot of feelings that are coming up. And one of the issues that she deals with is obsessive compulsive behaviors, and she washes her hands compulsively. And I remember watching it and thinking about what this character and anyone who actually is a true germaphobe truly deals with that particular brand of obsessive compulsiveness. And I think probably a lot of us developed a little bit where there may not have been some before in the event of, going through this pandemic. We've all got our things that we're a little obsessive about, to the extent that they can become a little ridiculous and inconvenient. Me, while I would argue that, yes, it's good for me to pick up garbage in general, sometimes I probably do go a little too far out of my way, or I can be a little bit ridiculous about it. And I absolutely agree with you that fundamentalism, or honestly, if we want to look at different kinds of fundamentalism, I think definitely in the wellness arena, there are people who won't eat any food that's not organic, people who don't get vaccines, people who do all kinds of things that they have kind of some could say false belief that it is going to do something to keep them safe. And that is what all of this comes down to, is this original human fear that something bad is going to happen to us. And so
it's really fear of death is what you're saying. Ultimately, people who exercise compulsively, for whom an hour of exercise a day is not nearly enough. In effect, if you take this to its logical end, they are trying to stave off death.
Or they have, I think that we see, even if it's not about staving off death necessarily, sometimes it's about not gaining weight and attaching to gaining weight all kinds of terrible things. So it's about avoiding that fate. And
fear of losing control.
It's about
fear
control.
Of if you give yourself an inch, it's a slippery slope. And then if you don't exercise for 2-3 hours today, oh my goodness, tomorrow I might not exercise at all. And then God knows what would happen. I would become overweight, or I would become slovenly, or, what, then I would no longer be right? So I think, again, fear.
Yeah, well, and as these times become more and more uncertain, how we find solace in the face of these fears becomes more and more complicated. And I want to tell you about this thing that I learned about the way that fundamentalism hijacks the brain and the way it spreads. This is like a kind of gross comparison, but I'm still excited to read it because I think it's really cool. So there's this, I'm going to use an example of a parasitic manipulation that happens when an insect called a hairworm, it's very, very small. What it does is it infects a grasshopper and it seizes control. Nature is amazing. It seizes control of a grasshopper's brain. Okay. in order to survive and self-replicate. So the parasite influences the grasshopper's behavior by inserting specific proteins into its brain. And then what happens is grasshoppers become slaves to these like parasitic self-copying hairworm machinery. Okay. So it's gross and crazy. And it's like not even a Twilight Zone episode. It's like something far, far darker and more terrifying. So in much the same way that parasites manipulate their host body in order to survive, fundamentalism is a parasitic ideology that inserts itself into the brains of people participating in it, and it commands individuals to act and think in a certain way that is rigid and intolerant to competing ideas. And it's strongly correlated with what psychologists and neuroscientists called magical thinking, which goes back to what we were talking about with science denial. So it refers to making connections between actions and events when there are no actual connections that exist. But the thing is, without magical thinking, without this sort of parasitic invasion, fundamentalism cannot exist. And so that is why they rely so heavily on it's like they sense the fear, they see the fear, and then they take over the brain, right? But then they have to create more fear.
So there's where the dogma comes from, right?
Right, exactly.
Right.
So,
and this whole notion of duality, you are good or you are bad. Whereas in some religions, there is good and bad. There's a good and a bad inclination in all of us that are both supposed to be there, and you're supposed to try to balance them. This idea that you can be good all the time then you're not human, right?
Yeah. I'm curious though, are you not specific to religion necessarily, but are you fundamentalist about anything? Is there anything that you adhere to so strictly that maybe some people might argue it's a little ridiculous?
Yeah, I have to pat every dog that's willing to be patted. Every dog I see.
I can confirm that.
Yes, every dog I see on this, I want to have at least a fractional relationship with that dog. It's, it's like the thing about always take time to smell the flowers. So my version of that is always take time to connect with a dog. Now, where does that come from?
Pretty dogmatic.
I'm not even going to respond to that one. My dad was that way. And it has become for me a way of honoring his memory, but also the point of it is to always have a moment where there's an exchange of love. And you can't always do that with a person who you've never met before. Lord knows I try. But with a dog, it's like appropriate to go up and go and on their faces and on their heads. It's okay. They love it. I love it. Everybody loves it. It's all good. Except the person who's walking with me, who's really sick of the interruptions. A friend of mine once told me she was telling me something profound. And like she was in the middle of sharing something that was big. And I did that. And was distracted by a dog, and I felt terrible afterwards. But yeah, so there's something where I think my behavior can be seen as obsessive or fundamentalist, if you will. What others? I mean, for me, it's mostly about connecting with people and connecting with dogs. I don't feel any need to connect with cats at all, or other animals, birds. No, I mean, they're fine. I'm happy they're there, but
yeah,
it's a real
they don't
draw.
feel any need to connect with you. Okay.
Yeah,
Cats.
Screw them.
I have a thing about that is also sort of a thing I do in honor of someone's memory that I'm a little obsessive about and fundamentalist about. My grandfather, my dad's dad, who I called Panta, he had a thing about returning grocery carts. And he he said, you always return a grocery cart. You never, ever, ever leave a grocery cart for someone else to put away. You always put it back. And he had a lot of little Ponta-isms that we used to call them.
I remember one of them was something about when you get kicked in the ass, consider the source or something like that.
Yes,
what was that?
Yes. When you're kicked by an ass, consider the source. The other one was he would always say, you should always, always, always tip well, because to you, it's just a couple of bucks. To the person serving you, it's a living. He had all kinds of great ones. But he had this thing about always returning the grocery cart. And I am, as I tend to be, a little obsessive, but it's like in that obsession, I am honoring his memory. And I feel like he is glad to know that I'm returning the grocery cart at Trader Joe's, even when it would be more convenient to leave it next to my car. That becomes more complicated when you have kids, though.
Right. Oh my gosh. When you're getting two different kids into two different car seats and you've got groceries and then, First of all,
yes.
Don't even take your kids to the grocery store. Like or certainly only one at a time, right?
Yeah. It's a bit much. And Trader Joe's has those little mini carts, and it's a really cute idea.
The cutest.
But I don't know about your granddaughter, but my daughter is not a very trustworthy grocery shopper. Like, obviously, I'll keep an eye on. It's just a bit much to manage my cart and her cart while she puts 6 boxes of cheese crackers into them. So I got to make sure that those go back on the shelf by the time we get to the register.
Can I just say there was a cheese cracker shortage in LA last week, or certainly at the Vaughn's grocery store near my son's house. And this was a darn near crisis because not having, I tried to serve her a peanut butter cracker instead. Those they're like little Oreos, little tiny crackers with cheese in the middle or peanut butter in the middle. She's like, yo, I don't eat those peanut butter crackers. I eat cheese crackers. And the grocery store didn't have them. But I digress. Fundamentalism. So what are your big takeaways, Gabby?
I think my biggest takeaways are, for those if you're considering engaging in fundamentalism, maybe try to find a hobby or something else, because it's problematic. But I think also it's important for us. I'm always trying to put on my compassionate thinking cap when I think about someone whose beliefs are just so insanely different from mine. And I think it's important to remember, when you're talking to someone with fundamentalist beliefs, absolutely abhor their beliefs, keep your distance from them, especially if they're, if someone's beliefs include the fact that certain people aren't people and don't deserve rights, then stay away. But I think it's important to remember that most people come to really problematic beliefs out of fear. And they stem from fear, and then imagine being raised by a fearful fundamentalist family. You're not gonna understand the many layers of the world that we live in. And so I think that, and I think that a lot about people who I think are making wildly irresponsible decisions in the pandemic, or with their kids. Everyone is just trying to do, in general, they're just trying to do their best. Now, they may have, in my opinion, deeply flawed ideas of what that is, and problematic, harmful ways of executing that desire. But at the end of the day, most of us are just trying to do the best we can by the people we love. And so I try to hold that as I process my vitriol about the way other people are doing things.
Makes sense. I have one question for you. Knowing how often and how many memoirs I've read about people who were raised in some fundamentalist, again, I'm trying to think of another word for cult, but cult-like. environment and set of strictures, and then they left it. How often is fundamentalism a phase in people's lives rather than something that they adopt for their whole lifetime?
I'm married to someone who I wouldn't say he was a fundamentalist, but he was a much, much, much more observant and strict Jew than he is now. And I do think that, I don't think it's always true, but I do think there are people for whom it is a phase where there's, if you are able to seek, I think that the difference, Evan didn't grow up that way. He grew up with a pretty liberal relationship to Judaism, and then had was practicing in a very different way for a while, and then sort of found a happy medium and has been sort of in that place for a while. I think that when someone is raised in a cult and then escapes the cult, then it's not so much a phase as it is, they saw the light somehow and are moving away from something. So I think that, but that's really common. I know lots of people who grew up very religious in one way or another, and or who were even involved in various kinds of cults. There's a great podcast, by the way, and we'll link it in the show notes, and it's called Sounds Like a Cult, that examines all the different cults, all of the cult-like things that we deal with in life. Some of them are really funny, like they talk about whether Trader Joe's is a cult. I would argue that to a certain extent it is. Yoga, at least the way it is in the United States now, which is very different from the origins of yoga. It's a great podcast. So I think that there are many people have phases in life, especially in that phase that you were referring to, post high school, post college, trying to figure out what to do with one's life, where they are fundamentalist about something.
And vulnerable to any sort of dogma or set of rules that can enable them to just submit themselves to this truth. And when you talked about people leaving a fundamentalist culture in which they were raised, seeing the light, I think it's more about it fits for some people and it doesn't fit for everyone. And one of the things about fundamentalist cultures often is that they don't believe in birth control. And so you have a large number of children in many cases. What are the chances that 100% of them are going to remain in the fold? Slim.
Well, if TikTok is to be believed, there are a lot of people who leave. At least the particular TikTok for you page I'm on is a lot of ex-Mormons and ex-Christian fundamentalists. And I think that especially if you're not totally straight and interested in
and cisgender and all of that.
Right, exactly.
Definitely doesn't work for those folks. Thanks so much for listening to our episode today on fundamentalism. You can listen to all the F words and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.
And join us on social media. We are All the F Words Pod on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Email us. We are allthefwordspod@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you.
Have a great week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.